Ladies and gentlemen, the only way forward is to commit to the agreement we have made. By making sure that Ukraine survives as a state within its internationally recognized borders. And by working for a real, just and lasting peace for Ukraine. That is our common responsibility. And that is why the Netherlands is doing all it can to support Ukraine. And we will do everything. We will do everything in our power to ensure that Russia is held to account and that justice will be done. We're taking a leading role in this for the very reason that all of us here should not accept a world where brute force prevails over justice. And that is why we strongly support the Ukrainian Prosecutor General and International Criminal Court. That is why we will be sending 2 more forensic investigation teams in 2023. And that is why we will host a new International Center for the Prosecution of the Crime of Aggression and a damages register in The Hague. Ladies and gentlemen, we all want peace. And the road to peace is actually very simple. This war can end today if Russia sends its soldiers home. Just send them home. Just send them home. But while this war continues, and as long as it continues, the Netherlands will do all we can to help Ukraine. And we call on you. We call on all of you, dear friends, to join us. To underline our commitment, our joint commitment to the UN Charter, to the rules-based order it presents, and to vote yes. To vote yes on the resolution that is put in front of this Assembly today. Thank you.
I thank the Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands. Now I give the floor to His Excellency Edgars Rinkēvičs, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Latvia.
Mr. President, a year ago, Russia started its brutal invasion against Ukraine. Latvia stands together with Ukraine against this senseless war. Latvia stands for justice. Latvia stands for just peace. We condemn in the strongest possible terms Russia's unprovoked large-scale aggression against Ukraine enabled by Belarus. Russia's actions are driven by its imperial and colonial ambitions. They undermine the rules-based international order rooted in the United Nations Charter. We are witnessing blatant disregard for the international law. As a nuclear power, Russia continues to use irresponsible nuclear rhetoric. Only this week, Russia suspended its participation in the New START Treaty. A permanent member of the United Nations Security Council attempts to change borders of another sovereign country by the use of military force. Permanent members of the Security Council have a particular responsibility to maintain international peace and security. Every sovereign country has a right to choose its own foreign policy course. It applies to Ukraine as well as to any other country. Ukraine has a right to defend itself against foreign aggression. Ukraine fights for its survival, its right to exist. The sole responsibility for the war lays on Russia. Russia started this war, and Russia alone can and must end it immediately. Я обращаюсь к народу России.
I address the people of Russia. Ukraine did not attack you. NATO did not attack you. It is your own government that attacked Ukraine. It is your soldiers that are killing peaceful civilians in Ukraine. You can stop this war, and you must do so. Russia must leave Ukraine.
Latvia strongly condemns deliberate attacks by Russia against civilian and critical infrastructure in Ukraine. Residential areas, schools, kindergartens, hospitals and critical energy infrastructure are destroyed by Russian bombings. Innocent civilians, including children, are killed. More than 17 million people have been forced to leave their homes or flee their country. The international community must continue to provide all necessary support to Ukraine, including military and humanitarian. Latvia's assistance to Ukraine has significantly exceeded 1% of our GDP. The provided support will set the pace for further reconstruction process in Ukraine. Latvia has engaged in the reconstruction of Chernihiv region. Horrific crimes in Ukraine remind of the bitter experience of Latvian people during the Soviet occupation. We condemn the illegal deportation of Ukrainian civilians to Russia and forced illegal adoption of Ukrainian children. We condemn the forced passportization and conscription to the Russian armed forces of the Ukrainian citizens. Russia must stop violating international humanitarian law and human rights. Crimes committed by Russia cannot and will not go unpunished. We commend efforts of the International Criminal Court to investigate atrocity crimes and to serve justice for victims. Regrettably, the International Criminal Court and national judicial systems cannot exercise jurisdiction to prosecute the crime of aggression. Latvia calls for establishment of ad hoc tribunal under the auspices of the United Nations. This will grant the tribunal strong international legitimacy and provide a basis for applying exceptions from the personal immunities. Those in Russian leadership responsible for crimes must be held accountable. Mr. President, Russian propaganda seeks to justify its legal invasion and to deny its crimes. It tries to shift the blame for global consequences of this war. We must resist such disinformation with truth and facts. Those Russian individuals and groups engaged in propaganda in support of Russia's aggression against Ukraine must be held accountable. To counter disinformation, Latvia will continue to support independent media. Russia's war against Ukraine has caused serious long-term geopolitical, economic, and humanitarian consequences far beyond Europe. Food and energy are instruments in Russia's warfare affecting people globally. It is Russia's war against Ukraine that has caused shortage of food supplies and the rise of energy prices, not the sanctions. We commend the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which must be continued. We support the work of the World Food Programme. Last year, the Latvian government decided to unblock the Russia's fertilizers in Latvian ports. Fertilizers are to be donated to countries of the Global South to improve food security worldwide. Mr. President, we welcome President Zelensky's 10-point peace formula and strongly support his vision for peace that rests on the principles of the United Nations Charter. Russia must withdraw its forces from the entire territory of Ukraine. I call on all members of the United Nations to support the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity. I urge member states to vote in favor of the resolution for just and lasting peace in Ukraine. May this year mark a victory over tyranny, cruelty, and sufferings. Thank you very much.
I thank the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Latvia. Now I give the floor to His Excellency Ignacio Cassis, Head of the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le...
Thank you, Mr. President. For a year now, ladies and gentlemen, we have all been witnessing the serious violations of the United Nations Charter in Ukraine. For a year now, Russia's military aggression against Ukraine has continued in defiance of international law. For a year, the trust and the security order that has prevailed in Europe have been under threat. Every country in the world has been affected in some way by the repercussions of this war. Its consequences are disastrous. The human cost is impossible to quantify. In addition to the thousands of dead, wounded, and missing on the ground, more than 8 million people have had to flee their homes. 8 million. This represents the entire population of my country, Switzerland. Last year, I saw with my own eyes the destruction and suffering in and around Kyiv. All of us here now have the names and the inhuman images of Bucha, Kramatorsk, Mariupol, Kharkov, and Kherson in our minds. These horrors are taking place as we are about to commemorate the 75 years of the Geneva Conventions next year. With these conventions, we wanted to raise the law above barbarism, including international humanitarian law. We wanted to turn the page on the experiences of past wars. This assembly has repeatedly stated that such wars must never happen again. The Russian military aggression against Ukraine shows us once again that we are not safe. A permanent member of the Security Council has decided to attack its neighbor, an independent and sovereign nation. But let us not give up. That would be a serious mistake. It would be a vindication of all forces seeking power, no matter how they use it. Mr. President, with the resolution submitted to the vote today, we are sending a strong message of peace and respect for the law and the principles that unite us. Switzerland strongly condemns the serious violations of humanitarian and human rights law committed in Ukraine. And I call on the entire international community here today to work side by side towards a peaceful resolution of this conflict. Ukrainians have the right to live in peace. A peace built on the fundamental principles of international law, such as the prohibition of the use of force, territorial integrity, and national sovereignty. Switzerland is ready to play its part. Let us together reaffirm the importance of the United Nations Charter at a time when major challenges require urgent global solutions. Consider energy shortages, food insecurity, inflation, climate change, and migration. These challenges remind us that we all depend on each other. They remind us of our responsibilities. Turning inward is not a solution. Let us strengthen our ties, mend the cracks in our institutions, and restore our mutual trust. Finally, we must allow the Ukrainian people and all the peoples of the world who have been struck by war to regain hope and live in peace. Our unity is critical thanks to ongoing efforts such as the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Some of the negative consequences of the war have been mitigated on the human, security, political, and economic fronts. Switzerland is providing humanitarian aid, hosting refugees, and has launched the reconstruction process in Ukraine last summer in Lugano. But more needs to be done, for example, in the area of humanitarian needs and, above all, demining. My country will continue to support Ukraine while not forgetting other conflicts around the world. On Monday, for instance, I will be hosting a pledging conference for Yemen in Geneva with my Swedish counterpart. Mr. President, by supporting this resolution on Ukraine today, on the eve of the first anniversary of the war, we are sending a clear message in favor of the UN Charter. Expectations are high, ladies and gentlemen. Let us not disappoint those who are counting on us, whether in Ukraine, in Russia, or in any other country. I thank you.
Je remercie le ministre.
I thank the Federal Minister of Switzerland.
Now I give the floor to His Excellency Kostadin Kojabashev, Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Bulgaria.
Mr. President of the General Assembly, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Bulgaria aligns itself with the statement delivered on behalf of the European Union yesterday. A year has passed since the start of the Russian Federation's unprovoked and unjustified war of aggression against Ukraine. A war which is not only in gross violation of international law and of the principles of the UN Charter, but has seriously damaged global security and stability and has caused and continues to cause immense suffering. During this year, the General Assembly has consistently come together to stand against this despicable act of aggression and against the violation of the UN Charter. Together, we need to continue to fiercely defend the principles of the UN Charter, international law, and the rules-based order because they are our only guarantee for peace. I reiterate once again Bulgaria's unwavering support for the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, including within its territorial waters. We stand with Ukraine and we will not recognize Russia's attempted annexation and illegal referenda. We demand that the Russian Federation immediately cease its military actions and unconditionally withdraw all its forces and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine. Mr. President, Russia's war of aggression has resulted in thousands of casualties and injured, massive displacement of civilians, catastrophic destruction of critical civilian infrastructure. Bulgaria is deeply concerned with the continued worsening humanitarian situation. We call for respect of international humanitarian law and unimpeded humanitarian access. Bulgaria, as all other EU member states, has kept and will continue to keep its borders open to everyone fleeing the war in Ukraine without any discrimination. We will continue to provide humanitarian assistance on the ground via different humanitarian actors, including OCHA, UNICEF, and ICRC. The global food crisis that the world faces today, initially triggered by climate changes, conflicts, the pandemic consequences, has been very significantly aggravated by Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Bulgaria will do its part to mitigate the most immediate consequences of this crisis and will continue to work for finding long-term solutions. We welcome the Black Sea Grain Initiative and the leadership of the Secretary General in restoring the grain exports from Ukraine's Black Sea ports, while acknowledging that the situation remains very critical and the need for humanitarian assistance to a number of countries in the global south persists. We call for the renewal of the Black Sea Grain Initiative in March and for its unimpeded implementation. Mr. President, the Russian Federation bears full responsibility for its aggression and all the destruction and loss of life, and it must and will be held accountable in accordance with international law. Only through ensuring justice for all victims will stand a chance to prevent such crimes in the near future. Excellencies, today the General Assembly bears a historic responsibility to stand for the principles of the UN Charter, to stand for peace and for international rules-based order. Bulgaria is proud to have co-sponsored draft resolution principles of the Charter of the United Nations underlying a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine as it stands for peace. Its purpose is to help bring this conflict to an end and to reaffirm our collective support for the international principles upon which a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace must be based. I urge all of you to vote in favor of the draft resolution in front of us. I would like to thank the Ukrainian people for their extraordinary courage and resilience. And finally, I reiterate once again Bulgaria's unwavering support for the efforts of Ukraine to achieve a lasting peace in line with the United Nations Charter and the international law. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Bulgaria. And now I give the floor to His Excellency Peter Burke, Minister of State for European Affairs and Defense of Ireland.
President, Ireland aligns itself with the statement of the European Union. President, we meet today to mark 1 year since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. A year of horrific death and destruction caused by Russia's illegal and unjustified war. Let us be clear. This invasion was unprovoked and entirely of Russia's making. Let me also be clear. Ireland will continue to stand fully with Ukraine and its people in the face of this brutal Russian aggression. President, this year and this war have been marked by Russia's blatant disregard for human life, for the UN Charter, for border international law, including international humanitarian law. Russia has ruthlessly targeted civilians and civilian infrastructure, seeking to starve and freeze the people of Ukraine into submission. Russia's war has seen the deaths of tens of thousands of Ukrainians, men, women, and children. It has forced over 13 million people to flee their homes in search of safety. Over 8 million refugees, mostly women and children, have sought protection across Europe. Over 5 million people have been displaced within Ukraine. Millions more have been forcibly deported to Russia and held in contravention of international law. Yet, despite all of this, Ukraine remains steadfast in its resistance and the defense of its democratic principles. This war has also seen a generation of Russian youth sacrificed to President Putin's imperialist fantasies. President, this is a war of choice. Just as Russia chose to start this war, they can choose to end it. We strongly support the tireless efforts by the UN Secretary-General, as well as by Ukraine itself, to bring an end to this conflict and for a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace based on the principles of the UN Charter. President, the effects of Russia's war are being felt across the world. Russia's actions have seen the world's most vulnerable people suffer from increased food and economic insecurity with the rising cost of energy and commodities. Ireland and the European Union are responding to the global effects of Russia's senseless war, including through the EU solidarity lanes and the Team Europe response to global food insecurity. We will continue to stand with the people of Ukraine and the most vulnerable around the world. We support the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which must be continued to allow life-saving grain to reach those who need it. President, this is a war that has seen reckless Russian attacks on nuclear facilities in Ukraine. A year of threats by Russia to use nuclear weapons on those that might come to Ukraine's aid. It is regrettable and worrying in this regard that Russia has now chosen to suspend its participation with the US under the New START treaty. President, Ireland remains fully committed to the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Those borders have not changed, and Russia's use of force will not change them. Ireland calls on the Russian Federation to immediately cease hostilities and unconditionally withdraw from the entire territory of Ukraine. We call on the Russian Federation to refrain from further threats or the use of force of any kind, including nuclear weapons, against Ukraine or any other member state, which could have serious implications beyond the region. Russia's actions are not just a threat to Ukraine. They are a threat to the entirety of the UN membership. Every state relies on the rules-based international order for their prosperity, for their independence, for their sovereignty. If we fail to hold Russia accountable, if we fail to respond to their attack on the UN Charter, we will leave the world in a more dangerous place for us all. President, the international community and the General Assembly have repeatedly made clear its condemnation of this war, including through this special resolution. As we mark this anniversary, with no end to Russia's war in sight, a further resolution is being put to the General Assembly calling for a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in line with the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. We call on all member states to support this resolution. Thank you.
I thank the Minister of State for European Affairs and Defence of Ireland. Now I give the floor to Her Excellency Joanna Sumuvuori, State Secretary to the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Finland.
Mr. President, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. A year ago, in the early hours of 24th of February, we woke up to a new grim reality. Russia had launched a brutal full-scale invasion of its sovereign neighboring country, Ukraine. Russia's unprovoked and unjustified aggression against Ukraine was a turning point. For the past years, Russia has been turning away from cooperation and rule-based international order. The illegal annexation of Crimea and the war in eastern Ukraine that started in 2014 changed our perception of Russia. Yet, most of us could not imagine a full-scale war. It is important to remember that the path of dialogue and diplomacy was always an option. That was not the path Russia took. War and destruction were Russia's choice. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, it is appalling to see a permanent member of the UN Security Council disregard its obligations for maintaining peace and security. Instead, we are witnessing a flagrant violation of international law and the UN Charter and commonly agreed principles. Russia's methods of warfare in Ukraine systematically violate international law, most notably the laws of war. Russian missiles have targeted Ukrainian civilians and infrastructure, causing immeasurable damage and suffering. The attacks have destroyed hospitals, maternity wards, schools, kindergartens, and places of worship. Testimonies from Ukraine and the areas liberated from the Russian occupation tell the gruesome tale of torture, extrajudicial executions, and sexual violence. Our message is loud and clear. We must hold Russia accountable for its violations of international law, including repatriations for damage. We must ensure that there is no impunity for atrocity crimes committed in Ukraine. It is not only morally imperative, but it's our right and our duty to do so. Mr. President, Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine has serious consequences and causes human suffering, not only in Ukraine, but also globally. Finland continues to provide political, defense, humanitarian, and financial assistance to Ukraine and its people. Global ramifications of the war include food and energy crisis, and Finland continues to support global community to alleviate negative consequences of Russia's actions. We also support the implementation of the Black Sea Grain Agreement. Mr. President, today the General Assembly is going to decide on a resolution on principles of comprehensive, lasting and just peace in Ukraine. The resolution is about Ukraine, but it's also about all of us. Wouldn't your country expect support from the United Nations, from all of us, if your country would be invaded and part of it annexed by a neighbor? Wouldn't you be disappointed if you did not get support from others? I also want to underline that according to the UN Charter, if a member state of the UN is attacked, it has an inherent right of self-defense, both individually and supported by other member states. Wouldn't your country seek support in such distress? Mr. President, Your Excellencies, Finland's support for Ukraine and its people remains firm. We also support President Zelensky's peace initiative and its implementation. To achieve comprehensive, lasting and just peace, Russia must immediately end its brutal and illegal invasion to Ukraine. We call on Russia to respect the independence and territorial integrity of Ukraine, to stop missile strikes on Ukrainian cities and withdraw its forces from the territory of Ukraine. It is our duty as the General Assembly to vote for the resolution before us and against the amendments proposed by Belarus. We need to show our strong support for Ukraine, its sovereignty and territorial integrity. Support for peace and the very principles of the UN Charter must be achieved in this room today. When UN Charter rule-based international order comes under attack, we must defend it together. Thank you very much.
I thank the State Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Finland. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Colombia.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, Excellencies, Colombia rejects the use of force against the territorial integrity or the political independence of any country, since this constitutes a clear violation of the fundamental principles and purposes of international law and the United Nations Charter. Likewise, we reject any unprovoked aggression by one state against another. This only entails adverse consequences for the civilian population, particularly women, children, and other vulnerable groups. These consequences include the loss of life, material damage, a shortage of food and energy, and rising poverty. Mr. President, in line with our total peace policy outside our national borders, the Colombian government calls on the parties to seek a negotiated, peaceful, and lasting settlement to the conflict in Ukraine, and we stand with the victims claimed by this conflict. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Colombia. And now I offer the floor to the distinguished representative of Uruguay.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, the 24th of February marks 1 year since the unjustified invasion of Ukrainian territory by military forces of the Russian Federation. This led to a persistent conflict with extremely adverse consequences, not only for the countries involved, but also for the region and the entire international community. Today, Uruguay joins its voice to that of numerous countries that have made calls aimed at bringing an end to the hostilities. Uruguay has spoken clearly in statements made in previous sessions of the emergency special session since last March. We have roundly condemned the military invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation.
We've denounced it as a clear violation of the principles of the United Nations Charter that all members must not only respect but also comply with and enforce. On this occasion, we urge the Russian Federation to cease its military operations and stop the aggression against Ukraine, reiterating withdrawing its forces from Ukrainian territory as soon as possible. Both parties to the conflict must make their utmost efforts to return to the negotiating table in order to resolve their differences peacefully, as stipulated by the United Nations Charter. Uruguay has insistently demanded full respect for international law and has recalled that it is illegal to acquire territory through the use of force or other mechanisms contravening the United Nations Charter. This rule of international law, provided expressly in the Charter and endorsed by the General Assembly, the Security Council, and the jurisprudence of the International Court of Justice, means that territorial annexation in the context of aggression by one state is a violation of the Charter of our Organization and of international law. Consequently, the Uruguay government reiterates its firm support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. For these reasons, Uruguay has co-sponsored and will vote in favor of the draft resolution before us in this meeting of the General Assembly, which contains a resounding call for the violence to be brought to an end and for just and lasting peace to be restored. In this context, I wish to recall that the rejection of the use of force and the peaceful settlement of disputes are fundamental principles of Uruguay's foreign policy. Finally, we reiterate our call so that through the negotiating mechanisms provided in the UN Charter with the participation of the Security Council and Secretary General, avenues for dialogue are found to make it possible to agree on the next steps to de-escalate the conflict, and so that through diplomatic negotiations, the parties to the conflict can resolve their differences and bring an end to the war. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Uruguay. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of China.
Mr. President, 1 year into the Ukraine crisis, the conflict is still grinding on and growing in scale, wreaking havoc to countless lives. Its spillover effect is intensifying. We are deeply worried about this. China's position on the Ukraine issue is consistent and clear. The sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries should be respected. The purposes and principles of the UN Charter should be observed. The legitimate security concerns of all countries should be taken seriously. All efforts conducive to peaceful resolution of the crisis should be supported. Under the current situation, I wish to share the following 4 points. First, the top priority is to facilitate ceasefire and cessation of hostilities without delay. Conflicts and wars have no winners. The longer the brutality, the greater the human suffering. We once again call on the parties to the conflict to remain rational, restrain their impulses, and prevent the crisis from getting worse or even out of control. The parties to the conflict should strictly abide by international humanitarian law, avoid attacking civilians and civilian infrastructure, protect women, children, and other victims of the conflict, respect the basic rights of prisoners of war. All parties should strictly abide by nuclear safety conventions and guard against man-made nuclear accidents. Nuclear weapons cannot be used. Nuclear war cannot be fought. All parties should join together against the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons, prevent nuclear proliferation, and avoid a nuclear crisis. Second, dialogue and negotiation is the only viable way to resolve the Ukraine crisis. At the beginning of the crisis, Russia and Ukraine held several rounds of talks and made important progress. Regrettably, peace talks have since stalled. The reason behind this warrants deep reflection. The lessons of history tell us that crises, however deep, can ultimately be resolved peacefully. No matter how difficult it is, the door to a political solution cannot be closed. We support Russia and Ukraine moving towards each other, resuming direct dialogue as soon as possible, bringing their legitimate concerns into the negotiation, setting out feasible options, putting an early end to the crisis, and giving peace a chance. Third, the international community should make joint efforts to facilitate peace talks. 1 year into the Ukraine crisis, brutal facts offer an ample proof that sending weapons will not bring peace. Adding fuel to the fire will only exacerbate tensions. Prolonging and expanding the conflict will only make ordinary people pay an even heftier price. We reiterate our appeal that diplomacy and negotiation cannot be abandoned. Efforts towards ceasefire and talks must go on. The international community should create conditions for this to happen rather than fan the flames and seek self-interest. We urge the countries concerned to stop abusing unilateral sanctions and long-arm jurisdiction. Instead, they should act in a way conducive to de-escalation. The international community should strengthen coordination and cooperation in energy, finance, grain, trade, and transportation, and work together to mitigate the spillover effect of the crisis. We support the UN General Assembly playing an active role in bridging differences, building consensus, and forging synergy among member states. Fourth, pursue common security and achieve lasting peace. Security is not the prerogative of just a few countries. One country's security should not be achieved at the expense of other countries' security. Bolstering or even enlarging military blocs will only undermine regional security and drive peace further away. The final settlement of the Ukraine crisis hinges on abandoning the Cold War mentality, giving due regard to and respecting the reasonable security concerns of all countries, thereby properly addressing their legitimate security aspirations and advancing the building of a balanced, effective, and sustainable European security architecture. Mr. President, as a responsible country, China always stands on the side of peace and dialogue, and always advocates peace and promotes talks. China will soon issue a position paper on the political settlement of the Ukraine crisis. We stand ready to continue playing a constructive role in resolving the Ukraine crisis and bringing about peace at an early date. Thank you, President.
I thank the distinguished representative of China. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, Mr. President, Excellencies, 1 year after the start of the Ukraine crisis, the conflict still shows no sign of ending, and the international community continues to grapple with a range of challenges, including devastating humanitarian consequences of civilians and serious implications for the global economy. Given these complex and difficult circumstances, it is essential that we remain fully committed to achieving a peaceful resolution and lasting peace in Ukraine. This must be done in accordance with the principles outlined in the Charter of the United Nations. Mr. President, the Islamic Republic of Iran's position on the ongoing conflict in Ukraine has not changed. We are steadfast in our commitment to upholding the principles and purposes enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations, including the principles of sovereign equality and territorial integrity of states. We urge all parties to fully comply with their obligation on the international humanitarian law, including taking constant precautions to protect civilians and critical infrastructure and facilitating safe and unfettered access to humanitarian aid for those in need. Mr. President, We acknowledge that this conflict is detrimental to both parties, as neither can gain any long-term advantage. To achieve a sustained solution, it is crucial for all involved parties to abandon their military ambitions and prioritize finding a peaceful diplomatic resolution. By prioritizing dialogue and diplomacy and addressing the underlying cause of the conflict, we can take crucial steps toward achieving a solution that not only mitigates the devastating humanitarian impact, but also restore regional stability and security. Against this backdrop of the increasing need to end the conflict, my delegation supports the idea of leveraging the Secretary General's capacity as mandated by the UN Charter to establish a cross-regional group of independent, competent, impartial countries. The Islamic Republic of Iran is ready to contribute to this process, which could be critical in facilitating constructive dialogue and assisting in identification of solution to the current impasse in the Ukraine conflict. As a first step, we call for an immediate and comprehensive ceasefire coupled with the provision of humanitarian aids to those in need, which should take precedence over all else. Mr. President, on the anniversary of this tragic conflict, we had hoped that the draft resolution before us would present a practical and achievable means to bring the end to the conflict, consisting with the UN mission. Unfortunately, the proposed text falls short of the comprehensively and impartially addressing all aspects of the issue and fails to acknowledge the condition and provocation actions that have contributed to the crisis. Moreover, the policies and the action declared by certain sponsors of this resolution raise doubts about their political will to resolve the dispute peacefully. These policies and actions on the ground have only aggravated the situation rather than promoting a peaceful and lasting solution. Instead of bringing the member of a state together, the resolution may further polarize them, potentially worsening the conflict in Ukraine. We believe that any resolution to this issue must be based on a thorough and unbiased assessment of the situation and underlying cause of the conflict, and must consider all relevant factors and perspectives. It is also critical that all parties involved demonstrate a genuine commitment to reaching a peaceful resolution and take concrete steps in that direction. In the light of these concerns, our delegation has decided to abstain from voting on this resolution. Nonetheless, we remain committed to working toward a peaceful and sustainable resolution of the conflict, and we stand ready to engage in constructive dialogue and cooperation with all parties to achieve this important goal. Mr. President, I would like to address the reference made to my country by the representative of the Israeli regime during the general debate yesterday. Indeed, Iran-phobic campaign and widespread systematic dissemination of disinformation and baseless allegations against Iran have always been one of the main elements of the statement by the Israeli regime in this august body. The Israeli regime cannot conceal its brutalities in Palestine or distract attention away from its long-standing malign activities and demoniac policies in other countries. The Israeli regime is notorious for its atrocities and apartheid policies against the people of Palestine and region by targeting and killing innocent people, including women and children, in occupied Palestine. The Israeli regime continues to commit flagrant and systematic violation of human rights and all norms of international humanitarian law, especially the core crimes of genocide, crime against humanity, war crime, and crime of aggression. In this regard, we strongly condemn the Israeli regime's recent terrorist attack early on Sunday, 19 February, against a civilian residential building in the densely populated district of the central Damascus, which continued a flagrant violation of international humanitarian law and endangering regional and international peace and security. The international community must strongly condemn such attacks and compel the Israeli regime to end all acts of aggression against Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity immediately. Possessing all types of the weapons of mass destruction, as well as the most sophisticated conventional weapons, the Israeli regime continues to endanger peace and security in the region and beyond, and at the same time reasonably defies constant strong international call to join internationally legally binding instruments banning weapons of mass destruction. Nevertheless, it attempts to portray Iran's conventional weapons capabilities or its exclusively peaceful nuclear program as a challenge to the regional stability. Mr. President, while we reiterate our commitment to ongoing bilateral cooperation with Ukraine and Russian Federation, my government categorically rejects unsubstantiated claims that Iran has transferred unmanned aerial vehicles for use in Ukraine conflict. Such claims are nothing more than a propaganda campaign used by certain states to advance their political agenda. Iran is willing to engage in constructive bilateral technical and expert exchange with Ukrainian experts in order to clarify the unsubstantiated allegation leveled against it. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Romania.
Mr. President, Romania aligns itself with the statement delivered yesterday by the High Representative of the European Union, Mr. Borrell, on behalf of the European Union and its member states. I would like to add some points in my national capacity. What we wish for, on the cusp of the one-year mark since the start of Russia's fully-fledged war of aggression against Ukraine, is very simple. Peace for the people of Ukraine, victory of principles and values, and one less bloody conflict for the world. But what we are still witnessing is very different. We continue to see an alarming level of hostilities with no sign of abatement, with unimaginable sufferings for the civilian population and dire and long-lasting consequences. The human rights and humanitarian consequences of the Russian Federation's aggression against Ukraine, including the continuous attacks against its critical infrastructure, are particularly worrying. No less cruel are reports of the atrocities committed on the territory of Ukraine, for which we must ensure accountability. This continued aggression undermines the core of the rules-based international order and effective multilateralism, and remains a matter of concern for the international community. The hybrid war proliferated by Russia, even more intense through fake news, disinformation, and malign interferences, aims not only to destabilize the region and the most vulnerable states, as the Republic of Moldova, but also to undermine our unity, mutual trust, and solidarity. The Russian Federation is testing the resolve of the world to stand up for its norms and values. By attacking the basic principles enshrined in the UN Charter, the Russian Federation, as a permanent member of the Security Council, is also attacking the very foundation of the international peace and security. The stakes of this conflict are clear to all of us, and the world has to send a clear message. There is no justification for bloodshed, destruction, and human suffering. We need the full force, determination, and legitimacy of the General Assembly to reaffirm that international law matters, that the Charter matters, and that we stand by the rules put in place for the protection of every single member state of this organization. The upcoming vote on the resolution in front of us, which we must adopt with the largest possible majority, is an opportunity to reaffirm our support for Ukraine and the Ukrainian people, and to call for a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine based on the principles of the UN Charter and international law. Mr. President, Romania has been at the forefront of countering all multidimensional effects of this war since day one. Romania is also fully engaged in international efforts to end Russia's impunity. We are also a strong supporter of the efforts to seek accountability for all crimes committed in Ukraine. The perpetrators must pay, and our collective efforts must be efficient in this regard, as Ukraine seeks the justice it deserves. We support the establishment of a special tribunal for the crime of aggression in relation with the situation in Ukraine. Romania has stood by Ukraine, our direct neighbor, during this whole year of the Russian aggression. A multidimensional effort has been ongoing for the past year to accelerate the transfer of around 13 million tons Ukrainian grain, I repeat, 13 million, 1-3, through Romanian territory. These have reached countries in the global south that have been greatly impacted by the increase in global food prices and that have been already facing food insecurity. The Romanian port of Constanța at the Black Sea has become the main gateway for Ukrainian grain shipments, a real food hub at the European level, a direct effort to contribute to ensuring global food security. With the same goal, we have also advocated and we hope for a continuation of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Around 3.6 million Ukrainian citizens have entered Romania so far. Among these, over 110,000 remained. We have offered humanitarian aid to those in need. We have also set up a humanitarian hub, and all this to reduce the suffering and help Ukrainians to defend and build their way to peace. Mr. President, what we all want is peace. This was made clear today and yesterday by countless delegations. A comprehensive, just, and lasting peace. A peace that does not reward the aggressor. A peace based on the principles of the UN Charter, which we have bravely stood up for in the past. And peace in Ukraine cannot be restored by inaction. As a matter of urgency, the Russian Federation must reserve its illegal actions and unconditionally withdraw its military forces from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. And this call is what the resolution before us delivers. We have the power to unite around this text. Romania supports the draft text, is one of the co-sponsors, and calls on the whole UN membership to vote in favor of this resolution for a just and lasting peace in Ukraine based on the principles of the UN Charter. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Romania. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance.
Mr. President, Excellencies, it has been 1 year since the Russian Federation launched its illegal war against Ukraine. 1 year of aggression, of war crimes, of crimes against humanity. 1 year of brutality against the basic principles of the UN Charter, against the promise of democratic rights and freedoms, against the international rules-based order, and respect for the sovereign equality of all member states. 1 year of death, displacement, and devastation occurring each day in territories invaded by Russia and reviewed in areas recovered by Ukraine. International IDEA reiterates its condemnation of Russia's illegitimate and immoral war against Ukraine and urges the immediate and unequivocal withdrawal of all Russian military forces from Ukrainian territory. Until this occurs, we welcome the adoption, enforcement, and continued escalation of sanctions by the international community against the Russian Federation. Ultimately, the responsibility of the Russian Federation must be addressed in accordance with General Assembly Resolution 60/147 and Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This accountability is a matter of international law, and rule of law must and shall prevail. We encourage the UN Secretary General to continue working to advance ceasefire talks and to support increased humanitarian access to the war-affected areas and protection of civilians. The resolution being debated today calls for a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine. Such an objective is inextricably connected to the democratic ambitions of the Ukrainian people. As International IDEA has noted previously, this conflict is about democracy as much as it is about sovereignty. Over many years, and despite many obstacles, Ukrainians have repeatedly affirmed their commitment to democratic values. The result has been steady improvement across a variety of democratic indicators, including respect for media freedoms, the fight against corruption, and the conduct of free and fair elections as measured by International IDEA's indices and reports. Today, this hard-won progress hangs in the balance. But let us be clear, Ukrainians have chosen democracy. There's a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine must be a democratic peace determined by and for Ukrainians. Support from the international community should reflect this democratic imperative. Among the needs of a post-war Ukraine, democracy support and the defense of human rights will be crucial. Excellencies, the outcome of this institutional process will reverberate far beyond Ukraine. It is a test of the defense and rebuilding of inclusive and sustainable democracy as a guarantor of rights for both people and nations. In this effort, we should not lose sight of the need to enable a path for democracy to return to Russia as well, as part of securing a lasting and regional and global peace. We must say clearly, a democratic Russia would have not unleashed this tragedy. Advancing democracy is the single best way to build and guarantee global peace. Ukrainians are putting their lives on the line every day to defend the values that we claim to hold, the values of the UN Charter, of sovereignty, human rights, and multilateralism. Helping them to preserve a future for Ukrainian democracy will be our greatest tribute to them. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. Now I give the floor to Her Excellency Annalena Baerbock, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Germany.
Esteemed colleagues, 45 seconds. 45 seconds to get your grandmother to safety. 45 seconds to make it to the basement. 45 seconds. That's how long it takes for missiles from Russia to hit the city of Kharkiv after you hear the sirens. I met teenagers in Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine for whom counting to 45 has become part of their daily life. Teenagers, grandmothers, fathers who want nothing more than for this war to end, to have peace. Russia's war of aggression has not only brought terrible suffering to the people of Ukraine. This war has opened gaping wounds across the world. Families on all continents who cannot make ends meet because of rising food and energy prices. I think all of them and most of us here agree on one simple thing. We want the suffering to stop in Ukraine and worldwide. We want this war to end. We want peace. And the good thing is, we do have a peace plan right here in front of us. It's called the Charter of the United Nations. Its principles, which apply to every state, are very simple. Sovereign equality, territorial integrity, and the non-use of force. That's why the road to peace is also very clear. Russia must withdraw its troops from Ukraine. Russia must stop the bombing. Russia must return to the UN Charter. Each and every one of us here today has an opportunity to contribute to this peace plan by telling the aggressor to stop, by making clear that it's not peace if an aggressor tells its victim to simply give up, that it's not peace if an aggressor is rewarded for its ruthless violence. This would run counter to the very essence of our United Nations Charter. It would not mean peace, but more violence. That's why we are supporting Ukraine in its right to defend itself as enshrined in Article 51 of the UN Charter. I've heard also today some of you who said that by arming Ukraine, we are adding fuel to the fire. Let me ask you honestly, why on earth would we do that? We did not want this war. We did not choose this war. We too would much rather focus every bit of our energy and also of our money on fixing our schools, on fighting climate crisis, on strengthening social justice. But the truth is, if Russia stops fighting, this war ends. If Ukraine stops fighting, Ukraine ends. And the human suffering would continue every single day. Abduction, rape, torture. Children counting to 45 every single day to save their lives. The war's global trade of devastation would continue. Inflation, energy shortages, hunger. That's why today's vote is also about all of our futures. Today, each and every one of us here has to choose. To stand isolated with the oppressor or to unite for peace. To stay silent or to protect our UN Charter. so that the Charter can protect us. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished Minister for Foreign Affairs of Germany. We have heard the last speaker in the debate on this item. We shall proceed to consider draft resolution A/ES11/L7 and draft amendments A/ES11/L8 and A/ES11/L9, starting with the explanation of vote before the vote at 3 o'clock sharp. This meeting is adjourned.